Greetings, dear listeners of this channel. I am immensely grateful to you for choosing me. Please forgive my mistakes. I truly do my best and appreciate your feedback. Please stay tuned to this channel and enjoy your time in a world where the mind is free. I signed the contract for the position of a diplomat of the Galactic Tribunal on the day I turned 32, fully convinced I would be serving peace. I know it sounds naive now, looking back, but back then, I truly believed in the code. 3,000 years without war between advanced civilizations, an incredible achievement, right? My mother cried with pride at the ceremony, and my father shook my hand and told me I would be protecting the most important thing in the galaxy. The tribunal seemed like a temple of justice rising above all conflicts, a place where reason defeated violence. I went through 7 years of training, passed 42 exams on interstellar law, and learned communication protocols for 16 different intelligent species. And when I first walked into the tribunal's central hall on Elysium Prime Station and saw those endless holographic vaults with the code's texts shimmering in 100 languages, I felt like I'd found my calling. The Code of Peace wasn't just law, it was a religion for half the galaxy. It was created after the Great Burning, when 4 advanced races nearly destroyed each other and wiped out 23 smaller civilizations that just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The text of the code is etched into a 3-kilometer-tall monolith of pure quartz that rotates in the very center of the neutral zone, and every civilization that reaches interstellar travel is required to send representatives there to sign it. Its main principle was crystal clear: no military action between signatories, no invasions, no acts of aggression. Breaking it meant total economic blockade and expulsion from the Galactic Council, which basically meant isolation and slow decline. The tribunal was made up of judges from the 7 oldest races who resolved disputes and ensured the letter of the law was followed. For the first 2 years, I worked in the archive department, studying precedents and preparing reports for senior diplomats. It was boring work, but I saw how the system functioned. Disputes over trade routes, territorial claims, conflicts over rights to mine asteroid fields. Everything was resolved through negotiations, compromises, sometimes economic sanctions, but never force. I read reports on hundreds of diffused crises that would have led to wars in the past, and each time I admired how reason and diplomacy beat primal instincts. The galaxy prospered. Trade-bound civilizations tighter than any military alliances, cultural exchange erased boundaries of misunderstanding, and joint scientific projects united former enemies. It felt like we had truly evolved, become better, wiser. I slept peacefully, knowing I served a cause greater than myself. But then I was offered a promotion and transferred to the Department of Indirect Conflicts, and everything changed. My new supervisor, Kalen of the Ilarian race, met me in his office overlooking the Orion Nebula and told me something that overturned everything I believed. He said real diplomacy begins where pretty words about peace end, and that the code is a tool like any other law, and smart people always find ways to use it. He opened a file marked with the highest classification and asked if I was ready to learn how the Galactic Order had really worked for the last 300 years. I nodded, not yet understanding that I was agreeing to cross a line I could never step back from. And when I started reading the documents about proxy wars, about how advanced civilizations used primitive species as pawns in games that officially didn't exist, I felt sick right there in that luxurious office with the view of the stars. My name is Vayner. I'm an Ilarian. And if you know anything about my species, you know we're incapable of lying to ourselves. It's in our genetics, a trait of our nervous system. So when I say I hate my job and at the same time believe it's necessary, it's not hypocrisy, it's just a fact I live with every day. My official title is Senior Coordinator of Cultural Programs in the Department of Indirect Conflicts. And if you ask any outsider what I do, they'll tell you, I help developing civilizations integrate into the galactic community. In reality, I'm a strategist. I plan wars that officially don't exist, manage conflicts between species that don't even know they're being manipulated, and I do all of it in strict accordance with the letter of the Code of Peace. Every morning, I wake up in my apartment on Elysium Prime, look at the diplomas on my wall, and ask myself when exactly I became what I used to despise. Illyrian culture is built around diplomacy and philosophy. From childhood, we're taught that the greatest power in the universe is the spoken word, the ability to negotiate, to find compromise. My father was a mediator in trade disputes. My mother taught intercultural ethics at the academy. I grew up hearing stories about how a well-constructed argument can prevent bloodshed, how a single successful treaty can save millions of lives. And I believed it wholeheartedly when I joined the diplomatic corps. 12 years ago, I was an idealist who thought he would be building bridges between worlds. But the system pulls you in slowly. First, they give you small assignments, settle a trade disagreement, find a compromise in a territorial issue. Then, the tasks get harder, the gray areas appear more often, and one day you realize you're no longer building bridges, you're planting mines under someone else's. My department is officially responsible for protecting the interests of small civilizations, and that's not entirely a lie. We do protect them, but only the ones that benefit us. I oversee 4 developing species in the Tau sector. They've all received technology, education programs, and medical support from us. We helped the Krags defeat an epidemic, built 3 orbital stations for the synths, taught the Dorlax the basics of quantum physics. And they all think of us as benefactors, as older siblings guiding them toward the stars. But the truth is, every investment has a price. Every gift is a hook we embed into their culture. When the time comes, when we need them to fight for our interests against someone else's proxies, they do it eagerly, believing they're defending their own freedom. I spend nights studying their psychology, their history, their fears and dreams, so I know exactly which buttons to press. The scariest part isn't that I do this. The scariest part is that I'm good at it. I get awards, bonuses, commendations from the Council for outstanding contributions to galactic stability. 3 years ago, I prevented a direct confrontation between the Illyrian and the Quartz conglomerate over the Alpha Sectus system by redirecting the conflict to our proxies, the Krags and the Synths. Officially, it was their own territorial dispute, nothing to do with high-level politics. 8 months of fighting, 400,000 dead, 3 destroyed colonies. But we and the conglomerate stayed within the code, didn't lose a single one of our citizens, and in the end, divided the system by mutual agreement. I was awarded the Order of the Keeper of Peace. I can still remember the faces of Krag soldiers in the holograms from the battlefield, their enthusiasm, their belief in the righteousness of their cause, and every time I see that damn medal, I want to smash it against the wall. The story began 153 years ago, long before I was born, and I know it in detail because we're required to study this moment as a turning point in modern diplomacy. Back then, the 2 largest powers, the Terran Alliance and the Vegan Empire, clashed over a deuterium-rich star system on the border of their territories. The conflict escalated for months, fleets gathering near the disputed zone, diplomatic notes growing harsher, and everyone understood it was heading toward war. But both sides were signatories of the code, and a direct military clash would have meant disaster, complete isolation from the galactic community, economic collapse, the loss of all allies. That's when a lawyer from the Terran Alliance, his name was Marcus Chen, noticed the wording of Article 3 of the Code. It stated very clearly, signatories agree not to engage in armed conflicts with each other. Signatories. Not all intelligent species in the universe, only those who had signed the document. Chen presented his analysis to the Alliance Command, and that was the moment the galaxy changed forever, though most never realized it. The logic was airtight. The code protects only advanced civilizations that have achieved interstellar travel and joined the treaty. But the galaxy has thousands of young species that haven't left their home systems, have no representation in the tribunal, and therefore are not signatories. Technically, they aren't covered by the Code of Peace. If such a species enters a conflict with another similar species, it doesn't violate the sacred treaty, even if the Terran Alliance stands behind one side and the Vegan Empire behind the other. The Vegans quickly understood what was happening and hired their own team of lawyers. 3 weeks later, both sides submitted requests for legal review to the tribunal, and the judges, however much they disliked it, were forced to agree. Technically, it wasn't a violation of the code. The first proxy war began 2 months after that decision, and I've read all the archived records of the event. The Alliance chose the Kets, a warrior species with a primitive space program just beginning to explore nearby planets of their system. The Vegans backed the Yols, more technologically advanced but less aggressive. Both sides sent advisors to their proxies, supposedly for cultural exchange and development assistance. The Alliance gave the Kets schematics for plasma weapons and engines for interplanetary ships, told them about rich deposits of rare metals in the disputed system, and hinted that the Yols were planning to seize those resources. The Vegians did the same on their side, only mirrored. Both species truly believed they were defending their interests, fighting for survival and prosperity. No one told them they were just pawns in someone else's game, playing out a match whose stakes had nothing to do with them. The war lasted 14 months and claimed the lives of 3 million Kets and 2 million Yols before the Alliance and the Empire reached a compromise and split the system. Their representatives signed an elegant agreement in the tribunal hall, shook hands, then sent messages to their proxies calling for peace and a ceasefire. The Kets and Yols stopped fighting, buried their dead, and to this day consider that conflict the greatest tragedy in their history. The tribunal conducted an investigation, reviewed all the documents, and issued a verdict. No violation of the code was found, since neither the Alliance nor the Empire engaged in direct hostilities against each other. The senior judges were furious. They understood the spirit of the law had been broken, but the letter remained untouched. Attempts to amend the code failed. Too many civilizations had already realized the opportunities this loophole offered. Over the next century and a half, the concept of proxy wars became standard practice, and now my department officially exists to coordinate these operations, though we call it by very different names. The Sigma Dragon system landed on my desk 6 months ago as just another file among dozens, but I immediately understood it would be big. 4 planets, 2 gas giants with moons rich in rare earth elements, and an asteroid belt so saturated with iridium and platinum that developing it would pay off within 10 years and turn a profit for the next 3 centuries. The problem was that the system sat exactly halfway between Alarian and Quartz conglomerate territory, in a neutral zone officially controlled by no one. We and the conglomerate submitted development claims to the tribunal at the same time, and the usual bureaucracy began. Legal battles, reviews, commission hearings. After 3 months, it became clear this wouldn't be resolved peacefully. Both sides had equal grounds to claim the system. Then, my superior called me in and said it was time to move to Plan B, and I knew what that meant. Time to choose champions. I spent 2 weeks analyzing every young civilization in our sphere of influence, studying dossiers, military potential, cultural traits, and their level of technological development. The choice fell on the Krags, and it made sense from every angle. They were a warrior race from a high-gravity planet, which made them physically stronger and more resilient than most humanoids. Their culture revolved around concepts of honor, clan loyalty, and military prowess, the perfect material for building an army. They had only recently reached space, mastered interplanetary travel within their system, but had no interstellar technology. For 20 years, we had maintained cultural ties with them, provided educational programs, built hospitals, saved them from a blue fungus epidemic 10 years ago. The Krags loved the Alarian, saw us as wise older brothers, and that made them ideal candidates. I knew they would follow us into fire if the situation was framed correctly. The conglomerate chose the synths, and I knew it even before seeing their dossier. The choice was obvious. The synths were the complete opposite of the Krags, fragile, with light bone structure, but incredibly intelligent. Their civilization developed along a technological path. They achieved space travel earlier than the Krags, even though they appeared on the galactic stage later. The synths built elegant ships, created complex automation systems. Their engineers were brilliant at miniaturization and energy design. They didn't have a warrior culture, but the conglomerate could give them weapons that compensated for the Krags' physical advantage. It was a classic setup: strength against technology, swords against shields, passion against calculation. I met with my counterpart from the conglomerate. His name was Zefkal, and we drank a synthetic coffee analog in a neutral cafe on Elysium Prime, discussing parameters of the coming conflict as calmly as chess players discussing tournament rules. We even joked about it, aware of how absurd it all was, but still doing our jobs. The plan was simple and elegantly cynical. The conglomerate and we would send cultural exchange expeditions to our respective proxies at the same time, give them the technology needed for interstellar travel, show them Sigma Dragon, and tell them about the vast wealth of the system. Then we'd hint that the other side planned to seize the system and use its resources to establish dominance in the region, threatening their independence and their future. The Krags and synths would, of course, decide they had to act first to protect themselves. They would ask us for help, for technology, for advisors, and formally, we would be helping allies defend against aggression, not starting a war. The tribunal wouldn't find violations because there wouldn't be any. Not by the letter of the law. I signed the documents approving the operation, and my hand didn't shake, although inside, everything tightened into a hard knot. Another war that doesn't exist. Another hundreds of thousands of lives that will become statistics in my reports about successfully resolving a territorial dispute. I arrived on Kragheim, the Krags' homeworld, on a cold morning by their local calendar, and they welcomed me as a hero. Thousands of Krags gathered at the spaceport, waving flags with the symbol of our cultural exchange, the interwoven stars of Ilaria and Kragheim. Their leader, an old warrior named Gregor, hugged me so hard I almost lost my breath and said that a great friend is always welcome in their home. They held a feast in my honor. Their children sang songs about friendship between our worlds, and the elders thanked me for everything the Ilarians had done for their people. I sat at the long table, ate their traditional food, drank the bitter fermented root drink, and smiled, while inside I recoiled from myself. They didn't know that I had come not as a friend, but as a puppeteer about to start pulling the strings. In my luggage were sealed containers with weapon schematics, tactical manuals, and carefully crafted misinformation that would turn their admiration for me into rage toward the synths. I spent the first week strengthening trust, meeting with military commanders, scientists, and political leaders. I told them about the greatness of the galactic community and what future awaited their people among the stars. Then, I began carefully slipping in information about the synths. First, harmless mentions of their technological progress, then more troubling details about their expansionist plans, all of which I, of course, invented. I showed them holographic maps of the sector, where Sigma Dragon shone like a jewel between our territories, and explained the incredible resources the system contained. Then, I casually added that our intelligence had intercepted synth communications about preparing an expedition to Sigma Dragon, and that the conglomerate was helping them acquire interstellar travel technology. Gracker frowned and asked if that meant a threat to the region. And I, pretending concern, said that we Ilarians were seriously worried about the balance of power in the sector. 2 weeks later, I gave them the first tech package, schematics for a hyperspace engine, simplified but enough for interstellar travel. I presented it as an act of goodwill, as support for allies in their development. Krag engineers looked at the holograms with reverence, and I explained how it worked, knowing they'd be able to build their first ships in 4 months. Then came the weapons, and here I was, especially careful. I couldn't just hand them plasma cannons and say, "Go fight." That would be too obvious. Instead, I told them a story about an ancient race that once lived in this sector and left behind technological artifacts. I showed them fake archaeological finds that our intelligence had aged and planted on one of Kragheim's distant moons. The Krags found the schematics themselves, decoded them with my help, and now believed this weapon was their discovery, their advantage. I only guided their research in the right direction, suggested solutions to complex engineering problems, sped up the process. Meanwhile, I received reports about what Zefkal was doing with the synths, and his strategy was a mirror of mine. He arrived on their planet as a scientific advisor, bringing educational programs and technological gifts. To the synths, he described the Krags as barbarians, an aggressive race waiting for a chance to attack more advanced neighbors. He showed them fabricated recordings of Krag military drills where their warriors practiced storming space stations, hinting that the next target could be the synths. The conglomerate gave them defensive technologies, shields, early warning systems, automated turrets. The synths, being a peaceful race, were frightened and grateful for the protection. Then, Zefkal told them about Sigma Dragon, saying the Krags planned to seize the system to gain resources for military buildup, and that the only way to prevent future aggression was to take the system first and establish a demilitarized zone. The synths, who believed in logic and preventive measures, agreed. Zefkal and I were creating the perfect storm, where both sides genuinely believed they were defending themselves from an aggressor, and both were ready to fight for it. The first shot was fired 4 months after my mission on Kragheim began, and officially, I had nothing to do with it. A Krag scout ship discovered a synth expedition in Sigma Draken, setting marker buoys around the richest asteroid belt. The Krag commander, a hot-headed young warrior named Drekkel, took it as a provocation and opened fire without requesting permission from his superiors. 3 synth ships were destroyed. Only 17 members of the 72-person crew survived. The synths immediately declared it an act of unprovoked aggression and demanded the tribunal intervene. The Krags insisted they were defending their legitimate interests in a neutral zone from unlawful expansion. The tribunal reviewed the data, held a session, and issued its verdict. Both sides had equal rights to explore the system. The incident was deemed an unfortunate misunderstanding, and both were advised to show restraint. No sanctions, no consequences. I read that verdict in my office aboard the diplomatic cruiser and knew exactly what was coming. The door to war had just been flung open. The next 3 weeks, the conflict escalated with terrifying speed, and I coordinated every move the Krags made from my command center, disguised as a cultural hub and Kragheim's orbit. My analysts intercepted synth communications and passed the decrypted data to the Krag command, supposedly collected by our trade ships in the region. I watched on the tactical screens as the synth fleet massed near the system's 3rd planet and advised Gracker to send a strike group there for a preemptive assault. The Krags obeyed, attacked, won, and their admiration for my strategic insight grew each day. The synths countered with retaliatory strikes using their technological edge. Their drones swarmed Krag ships, their electromagnetic pulses shut down enemy systems. But the Krags were braver, more aggressive, ready to board vessels and fight hand-to-hand, where their physical superiority was undeniable. The first month ended with a slight advantage for the Krags, and I felt a professional pride in how precisely my plan was working. I spent nights analyzing every battle, studying each side's tactics, identifying weaknesses, devising new strategies. It felt like a galaxy-scale chess game, and I was good at it. Maybe too good. When a Krag squadron fell into an ambush near the second gas giant and lost 4 ships, I spent the night developing a counterstrike plan that used the planet's gravitational quirks. The Krags executed it perfectly, destroyed the synth supply base, and captured 200 prisoners. Gracker contacted me personally. His face on the screen beamed with joy as he called me the greatest strategist his people had ever known. I accepted his thanks, gave him advice on handling the prisoners, emphasized the importance of following war conventions, and then disconnected with a strange sense of triumph. Deep down, I knew I was taking satisfaction in deaths I had helped cause, but that thought drowned in the adrenaline of success and the awareness of my own skill. By the end of the third month, the war had reached a stage of brutal stalemate, and the casualty numbers began to rise at a geometric pace. 40,000 Krags dead, 32,000 synths, 12 ships destroyed on each side, 3 small colonies wiped off their planets by orbital bombardments. The tribunal kept receiving complaints from both sides, conducted investigations, issued rulings calling for peace talks, but no one listened. Officially, it was a conflict between 2 non-signatories of the Code, a local dispute over resources that did not concern advanced civilizations. Zefkal and I even met on neutral ground, discussed the course of the war, aligned certain parameters to keep the conflict within set limits so it wouldn't attract too much attention. We acted like professionals, like 2 grandmasters discussing a match, and I remember him telling me he admired the elegance of my tactical solutions. I returned the compliment about his defensive strategies. Then we shook hands and went off to plan the next phases of a war that was killing thousands every week. The war had passed the 8-month mark, and I started noticing changes in Krag society that I neither planned nor anticipated. When I first arrived on Kragheim at the beginning of the mission, it was a world of warriors, yes, but also poets, craftsmen, farmers, a culture where military honor was part of their identity, but not its entirety. Now the planet had turned into a massive military camp. Every factory was producing for the war effort. Children in schools were learning battle hymns instead of traditional songs, and elders, who once passed down wisdom, were now training the youth to handle weapons. I walked the streets of the capital and saw posters with heroic images of fallen warriors, memorials growing week by week, and mothers who no longer cried at funerals. They simply stood there with stone faces because they had no tears left. Casualties had reached 120,000 on the Krag side, a staggering number for a species with a population of only 200 million. Every 10th family had lost someone, and the war had gone from a distant conflict to a personal tragedy for an entire people. I began waking up at night from nightmares, something unusual for an Alarian. Our physiology normally prevents those kinds of psychological reactions. I dreamed of the faces of Krag soldiers from the battlefield holograms, their final seconds before a synth drone tore through their ship's hull, their eyes filled not with fear, but with determination to fulfill the duty I had planted in them. During the day, I continued my work, analyzing tactical data, developing strategies, coordinating operations, and I did it professionally, flawlessly. But something inside me was starting to crack. I noticed how I avoided looking at casualty statistics for too long, how quickly I closed files containing the names of the dead, how often I lingered in the shower, trying to wash off a feeling that water couldn't remove. Gracker had aged 10 years in just a few months. His son had died in a battle near Sigma Dragon's 4th moon, yet the old warrior never blamed me. On the contrary, he thanked me for my wisdom and support. That was worse than any accusation. The breaking point came on an ordinary day when I was inspecting a training center for new recruits on the outskirts of the capital. Young Krags, some not even 18 by Earth standards, practiced in space combat simulators, learned teamwork, and prepared to deploy to the front in 2 weeks. The center's commander proudly showed me their progress, telling me how capable they were, how motivated. After the training session, one of the cadets approached me, a very young Krag named Kresh, with eyes glowing with enthusiasm. He thanked me for what I was doing for their people, said it was the greatest honor of his life to fight for the liberation of Sigma Dragon from the synth threat. He spoke about the sacred mission of protecting the homeland, about duty to future generations, and every word he said echoed my own propaganda, which I had so carefully woven into their culture. He asked if I would give him a blessing before he left for the front, and unable to refuse, I placed my hand on his shoulder and wished him courage and luck. When he left, I stayed standing in the empty hallway of the training center, and I physically threw up right there against the wall. I saw myself from the outside, a manipulator who turned the admiration of an innocent young man into a weapon against him, who sent him to die for interests that had nothing to do with him. Kresh would go to the front in 2 weeks. He had roughly a 30% chance of surviving the first month, and if he died, it would be recorded as a heroic death in a just war. But there was no justice. There was only me and Zefkal, 2 puppet masters who smashed 2 races together over a system with resources that our civilizations could have simply bought or mined elsewhere for a fraction of the blood already spilled. In that moment, I realized I had crossed a line where professional pride becomes complicity in mass killing. I returned to my ship, locked myself in my cabin, and for the first time in many years, allowed myself to ask, what have I become? And is it even possible to go back? The revelation came from the last place I expected. An independent investigative group from the planet Neutralis, a race of Varans known for their uncompromising reporting and reputation as incorruptible truth-seekers. Their team of 5 reporters conducted their own investigation into the Sigma-Draken conflict, and what they found shattered our carefully built structure of lies. They gained access to encrypted communications between me and Alarian Command, uncovered financial trails of technology transfers to the Crags, dug up falsified archaeological discoveries on a moon of Cragheim, and proved they were artificially created. At the same time, they exposed the conglomerate's operation with the synths, uncovering similar schemes of manipulation and disinformation. Their report, titled Bloodied Pawns: How Advanced Civilizations Bypass the Peace Code, was published across all major galactic networks simultaneously, and within 6 hours, half the galaxy knew about it. I learned about the disaster from an emergency call from my superior, who contacted me at 3 a.m. ship time and simply said, "It's all out. Prepare for the consequences." The synths received the information first. Their society was more technologically advanced and deeply integrated into galactic networks. Within a day, the report was translated into their language, and their reaction was immediate. The synth government called an emergency meeting, summoned representatives of the conglomerate, and demanded explanations. Zefkal tried to deny everything, claiming it was disinformation and hostile propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, decrypted messages, witness testimonies. The synths, being a logical race, didn't resort to emotional outbursts. They simply announced the immediate termination of all relations with the conglomerate and withdrew their forces from Sigma-Draken. Then, they did something no one expected. They contacted the Crags directly and gave them all the information, including proof of my involvement in the manipulation. The news reached the Crags 2 days later due to their less advanced communication infrastructure, and during those 2 days, I lived in a state of paralyzing fear, knowing a storm was coming that I would not be able to control. When the Crags learned the truth, their reaction was the complete opposite of the synth's restraint. It was an explosion of rage, betrayal, and pain built up over 8 months of bloody war. Gracker personally came to my ship with a squad of 20 warriors, and for the first time, I saw in his eyes not respect and gratitude, but pure, undiluted hatred. He didn't shout or threaten. He just stood in front of me on the bridge and spoke in a quiet, dead voice about how I had killed his son, how I had turned their people into hired killers, how I had dishonored them and used their trust as a weapon against them. He told me that Kresh, the young trainee who had asked for my blessing, died 3 days earlier in battle, and his last words were about how proud he was to serve a great mission. Gracker asked me if I felt proud of that. Proud that the young man died believing the lies I'd fed him. I couldn't answer, and my silence was a confession more damning than anything I could have said. He spat at my feet and told me I was no longer a friend of the Crags, that I was a worse enemy than the synths because I had betrayed those who trusted me completely. Over the next 3 days, Cragheim erupted in revolt. The Crags didn't attack the synths. Instead, they unleashed their fury on everything connected to the Illyrians. They stormed our cultural center in orbit. The evacuation of the staff happened at the last moment under fire from Crag ships. They tore down monuments celebrating friendship between our races, burned buildings constructed with our funding, and destroyed technologies we had provided. Young radicals demanded that I be found and put on public trial, while the elders barely held them back from lynching all Illyrians still on the planet. I watched all of this from orbit on the surveillance screens, seeing everything I had built over years falling apart. The Crags and Synths met on neutral ground a week after the revelation, and instead of continuing the war, they announced the formation of the Alliance of the Deceived Races, whose goal was to resist manipulation by advanced civilizations and protect the rights of young spacefaring nations. Other races began to join them, races that suspected or knew they had also been pawns in someone else's games. I hadn't created a victory for the Illyrians. I had created a new political force united against us through shared trauma and betrayal. The session of the Galactic Tribunal began a month after the exposure, and I entered the vast hall on Elysium Prime Station, feeling the eyes of thousands of observers from hundreds of civilizations on me. I was accompanied by a team of Illyrian lawyers, the best experts in interstellar law, and they had already explained our defense strategy. Technically, I had not violated a single letter of the Peace Code. There had been no direct military actions between the Illyrians and the conglomerate, no acts of aggression by any treaty signatory, no breaches of territorial borders. The Crags and the Synths had gone to war of their own free will. We had merely provided cultural and technological aid to allies, all documented, legal, and compliant with the law. The chief prosecutor, an Aquilon named Thorn, opened the case by reading the list of the dead, 223,000 Crags and Synths whose names echoed through the hall in absolute silence for 40 minutes. When he finished, he looked straight at me and said that all those people were dead because of the manipulations that I and my counterpart from the conglomerate had planned and executed, fully aware of the consequences. My attorneys delivered a rock-solid defense based on the letter of the law, and legally, they were flawless. They presented to the tribunal an analysis of each of my actions, proving that none of them violated the code. Transfer of technology to allies, legal. Cultural exchange, legal. Providing intelligence, legal. Strategic consulting, legal. The code forbids wars between signatories, but the Crags and the Synths were not signatories, which meant their conflict did not fall under the tribunal's jurisdiction. The judges listened with stone faces, and I saw some of them nodding, representatives of civilizations that had used or planned to use similar methods themselves. But other judges, especially the oldest among them, looked at me with barely concealed disgust. The chief judge, an ancient member of the Kronos race named Eldar, who had served the tribunal for over 200 years, interrupted my attorney's speech and asked me a direct question. Did I believe my actions were morally right, regardless of legality? The hall froze, waiting for my answer, and I realized this was the moment when legal technicalities gave way to simple human judgment. I stood and answered honestly, perhaps for the first time in all these months. No, I did not believe my actions were morally right. I believed they were monstrous, though legal within the existing system. My admission triggered a storm of reactions in the hall. Half the audience erupted in outrage, the other half applauded my honesty. Thorn used my answer as the foundation for proposing a radical reform of the code, to close the loophole, extend treaty protection to all sentient races regardless of development level, declare proxy wars a violation of the spirit of the law, and introduce sanctions for them. Representatives of young civilizations and some of the oldest races who remembered the horrors of the Great Burning supported him. But diplomats from dozens of advanced civilizations who had relied on proxy wars for a century and a half to resolve their disputes opposed the reform. They argued for diplomatic flexibility, for the right of advanced races to defend their interests, for the idea that the code could not regulate relations with those who had not signed it. The debates lasted 3 days, and with each hour, it became clearer that the tribunal was split down the middle. On the 4th day, the Union of Deceived Races, led by Gracker and representatives of the Synths, arrived at the station and demanded the right to address the tribunal. Technically, they had no status that allowed such a request, as they were not signatories of the code, but Eldar used his authority as senior judge to grant them the floor. Gracker stepped up to the podium, aged and scarred, and delivered a speech that changed the course of the session. He did not demand my punishment or call for vengeance. He simply told the story of his people, how they had believed in friendship among the stars, how they had given their lives for what they thought was just, and how that belief had been used against them. He said that the peace code, which was meant to protect life, had become a tool for avoiding moral responsibility, that advanced civilizations had built a system in which they could start wars and remain clean by the letter of the law. Then, he said the line that echoed across the entire galaxy. If the tribunal does not close this loophole, then the peace code is not a peace treaty. It is a license to kill through someone else's hands. Half the hall erupted in applause, the other half sat in grim silence. And I realized that the system that had existed for 3 millennia was now on the verge of total collapse. The tribunal delivered its verdict a week after Gracker's speech, and I stood in the center of the hall listening to the voice of the chief judge, Eldar, who sounded tired and disappointed. According to the letter of the peace code, I was found not guilty of violating interstellar law. All my actions aligned with existing regulations. No direct military conflict between signatories had been recorded, and technically, I had been fulfilling my duties as a diplomat, maintaining allied relations with developing civilizations. The hall erupted in outrage, with representatives of young species and the Union of the Deceived demanding justice. But Eldar raised his hand, calling for silence. Then, he added the part that turned this victory into the most bitter defeat of my life. The tribunal acknowledged that the spirit of the law had been violated, that moral responsibility for the 223,000 dead lay with me and my colleagues in the conglomerate, and that although I was legally free, the galactic community would forever remember me as a symbol of how noble principles can be twisted for political gain. I left the hall to boos and curses from half the audience, and even the Ilarian delegates, my own people, avoided meeting my eyes. The Union of Deceived Species didn't stop with my case. They used the surge of public anger to demand a radical overhaul of the peace code. Gracker, the Sinto leadership, and representatives of 18 other young civilizations that had become pawns in others' games over the last 50 years, presented a set of amendments. The central proposal was simple and revolutionary. Extend the code's protections to all sentient species, regardless of technological level or signatory status. Declare the manipulation of young civilizations for proxy wars a crime against galactic peace, and introduce monitoring mechanisms and punishments for such actions. The tribunal debated for a month, and I followed the sessions from my apartment on Elysium Prime, where I had effectively confined myself, unable to face the condemning looks outside. Advanced civilizations were divided. Some supported reform, recognizing that the old system had discredited itself, while others fiercely defended the status quo, insisting that protection couldn't be imposed on those who hadn't asked for it and carried no treaty obligations. I resigned 3 days before the final vote, not waiting to be asked to leave. My statement was brief. I cited personal reasons and said I could no longer serve in the Department of Indirect Conflicts. My superiors accepted the resignation without objection, even with a hint of relief. I had become a toxic figure associated with scandal, and the Ilarian government was trying to distance itself from me publicly, though, in private, some high-ranking officials implied I had simply followed orders and become a scapegoat. Those words offered no comfort. I spent my last night at work packing my office, looking at the awards and certificates on the walls, and realizing each one had been bought with someone else's blood. The Order of the Peacekeeper, which I had received for preventing a direct conflict in Alpha Sectus, now felt like mockery. I hadn't kept the peace. I had merely redirected violence toward those who couldn't defend themselves. I took it off the wall and threw it into the recycler, watching the metal melt in blue flame. The vote took place the day I left Elysium Prime aboard a cargo transport heading for the outer worlds, where I planned to start something new, far from diplomacy and politics. I watched the broadcast on a handheld terminal, saw the judges cast their votes one by one, watched the tally shift back and forth by 1 or 2 votes at a time. It wasn't just about amendments, it was a vote on what kind of galaxy we would become, whether we could evolve morally as we had technologically. When the final judge cast their vote, the broadcast abruptly cut out due to a technical failure, and I never learned the result. Maybe it was symbolic. The answer to whether the system would change wasn't meant to be decided by a single vote, but by the long work of generations after us. I shut off the terminal, looked through the viewport at the shrinking station, and thought about Kresh, the young crag who had asked for my blessing and died believing a lie. I couldn't bring him back, couldn't undo the past, but maybe by example, by my downfall, I had helped spark changes that would save others from the same fate. It was a faint hope, but the only one I had left as the ship jumped into hyperspace, carrying me away from the world I had helped break.